The jukebox cut out mid-song. Glasses stopped blinking. 50 heavily armed bikers turned their heads as a 6'4" Hell's Angel named Bull stared down at a terrified 10-year-old boy. The giant biker pointed a calloused, shaking finger at the silver pendant on the boy's neck. "Where did you get that?" It was a scorching Thursday afternoon in July 2004, the kind of Mojave Desert heat that distorted the horizon into wavy, watery mirages. The Copperhead Saloon sat just off a battered stretch of Route 66 near Needles, California, a windowless canna-block dive bar that smelled perpetually of stale beer, bleach, and decades of cigarette smoke. It was a local sanctuary, a place where people went when they didn't want to be found. Behind the scratched mahogany bar stood Maggie, a tough-as-nails woman in her late 40s who had seen just about every flavor of trouble the desert had to offer. Tucked away in the darkest corner booth, nursing a melting cherry cola, was her 10-year-old nephew, Leo. Leo was a quiet kid, small for his age, with a shock of messy brown hair and eyes that constantly scanned the room. He had been staying with Maggie for the past 3 months following the sudden death of his father. To pass the time, Leo usually sat in that exact booth, sketching in a battered spiral notebook. At exactly 3:15 p.m., a low, guttural rumble began to vibrate through the floorboards of the Copperhead. It started as a distant thunder, but quickly escalated into an ear-splitting roar. Maggie's hands froze on the pint glass she was polishing. The 3 regulars sitting at the bar immediately cashed out, leaving crumpled bills on the counter before scurrying out the back door. They knew the sound. A pack of Hell's Angels was pulling into the gravel parking lot. Through the propped-open front door, Maggie watched as 24 custom Harley-Davidsons kicked up a massive cloud of dust. These weren't weekend riders. This was the San Bernardino chapter. They rode in tight formation, their leather cuts baking in the 110-degree sun. Leading the pack was Jackson Riley, known on the street simply as Bull. He was a towering mountain of a man, standing 6'4" and weighing north of 280 pounds. His forearms were covered in faded prison ink, and a jagged scar ran from his left earlobe down to his collarbone. Bull was the sergeant-at-arms, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him across state lines. Flanking him were 2 equally imposing enforcers, guys known in the local files as Dutch, Miller, and Snake Henderson. The heavy wooden front door swung wide and the daylight poured in, framing the bikers in silhouette. As they stepped into the dimly lit saloon, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of hot engine oil, sweat, and worn leather. Maggie swallowed hard. She gave Leo a sharp, silent look from across the room. "Keep your head down and stay invisible." Leo shrank back into the cracked red vinyl of the booth, pulling his knees up to his chest. "Afternoon, Maggie," Bull said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that carried over the twang of the country song playing on the jukebox. "Bull," Maggie nodded, keeping her voice steady. "What can I get you boys? The usual?" "Yeah, pitchers of Coors." "Keep 'em coming until we say stop," Bull commanded, leaning his massive frame against the bar. The rest of the chapter fanned out, claiming the pool tables, the dartboards, and the prime booths. They were loud, boisterous, and entirely in control of the room. For the first 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. Maggie poured beer, the bikers laughed, and Leo remained completely unnoticed in his dark corner. But the heat and the boredom were getting to the young boy. His pencil snapped against the paper of his notebook. Frustrated, he reached under the collar of his faded t-shirt to pull out the only thing he had left of his father, a heavy, custom-made silver necklace. It wasn't a standard piece of jewelry. It hung on a thick steel chain, a massive, solid silver pendant that caught the neon glow of the Budweiser sign hanging over the bar. Leo absent-mindedly rolled the heavy metal between his small fingers, feeling the familiar grooves and jagged edges of the design. Bull Riley, having just finished his second pint, pushed off the bar and began walking toward the restrooms at the back of the saloon. His heavy boots thudded against the hardwood floor as he passed the shadowy alcove where Leo was sitting. A flash of reflected neon light caught his eye. Bull stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his massive head, his eyes locking onto the small boy in the booth. More specifically, his eyes locked onto the silver object dangling from the boy's hands. The sergeant-at-arms didn't move. He didn't breathe. The color literally drained from his sun-leathered face. For a man who had survived bar brawls, prison riots, and high-speed chases, he suddenly looked as though he had just seen a ghost. "Dutch," Bull snapped, his voice tight and dangerously low. Dutch Miller, who was chalking a pool cue nearby, looked up. "Yeah, Bull, kill the jukebox." Now, Dutch didn't ask questions. He walked over and ripped the cord right out of the wall. The sudden, deafening silence in the bar was terrifying. Every biker in the room stopped talking. Pool balls stopped rolling. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward their sergeant-at-arms, waiting for a command. Bull slowly approached the booth. He loomed over the table, casting a massive shadow over the trembling 10-year-old. He reached out a massive, scarred hand and pointed a calloused, shaking finger directly at the boy's chest. "Where did you get that?" The silence in the Copperhead saloon was so absolute you could hear the hum of the refrigerator compressor behind the bar. Maggie's heart dropped into her stomach. She dropped her bar towel and practically vaulted over the counter, rushing toward the booth. "Bull! Hey, Bull, back off!" "He's just a kid. He's my nephew. He doesn't know anything." Bull didn't even look at her. He just raised his left arm, holding it out like an iron gate to block Maggie from coming any closer. "I ain't gonna hurt him, Maggie," Bull said, his voice trembling with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly close to grief. "But I need to see that necklace. Right now." Leo was paralyzed. His wide, terrified eyes darted from the giant biker to his aunt. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he lifted the heavy silver chain over his head and placed the pendant on the scarred wooden table. Bull reached down and picked it up. It looked tiny in his massive palm. It was a custom-forged piece of silver, heavy and tarnished. It was shaped like a winged skull, clenching a broken motorcycle piston in its teeth. But what made it entirely unique was the right eye socket of the skull. It was set with a chipped, blood-red ruby, and the left wing had a distinct, jagged crack running through the silver, a flaw in the original casting that was never fixed. Every patch member of the San Bernardino chapter crowding around the booth instantly recognized it. Dutch Miller let out a low whistle. Snake Henderson took a step back, pulling his sunglasses off his face. It was the president's pendant. Specifically, it belonged to Ian John Riley, Bull's older brother, the founding president of their chapter. 15 years ago, in the winter of 1989, Ian John had vanished off the face of the earth. He had ridden out into the Mojave Desert one night to meet with a rival syndicate, and simply never returned. The club had spent months tearing the desert apart, searching every canyon and abandoned mineshaft. They found nothing. No body, no bike, no clues. The assumption was that the rival club had ambushed him, murdered him, and buried him deep. That assumption had sparked a brutal, bloody war that lasted for 3 years and cost the Hells Angels dearly. Through it all, the one thing Bull had always sworn to find was that silver pendant. Ian John had worn it every day of his life. He would never have taken it off voluntarily. It was a symbol of the chapter's bloodline. And now, a decade and a half later, it had just been pulled from beneath the t-shirt of a 10-year-old boy in a roadside dive bar. Bull's massive chest heaved as he stared at the silver skull. He gripped it so hard his knuckles turned white, the sharp edges digging into his palm. When he finally looked back down at Leo, his eyes were bloodshot and burning with a terrifying intensity. "Boy," Bull said, leaning down so his face was only inches from Leo's, "I'm gonna ask you one more time. And you need to tell me the absolute truth, or God help me, I will tear this bar down to the foundation. Where did you get this?" Leo swallowed hard, tears welling up in his eyes. He looked at Maggie, who gave him a terrified nod to answer the man. "My dad," Leo squeaked out, his voice cracking. "My dad gave it to me." Bull frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. "Your dad? Did he buy it? Did he find it in the dirt? Who the hell is your dad?" "That Toby Amando." "He didn't find it," Leo whispered, wiping his nose. "He said it was a reminder. He gave it to me right before he got sick, before he died 3 months ago." "What was his name, kid?" Dutch Miller barked from behind Bull, stepping forward. "Give us a name." "Arthur," Leo said, shrinking back. "Arthur Pendleton." The name hit the room like a bomb. If the bar had been quiet before, it was now completely devoid of oxygen. Bull stumbled back half a step, hitting the edge of the adjacent booth. Snake Henderson let out a string of vicious curses, pacing furiously in a tight circle. "Arthur Pendleton." Maggie gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. She knew the name, of course it was her brother-in-law, Leo's father, but she had no idea what that name meant to the men standing in her bar. To the Hells Angels, Arthur Pendleton wasn't just some random civilian. In 1989, Arthur Pendleton had been the chapter's bookkeeper. He was a quiet, nervous accountant who handled the club's legitimate businesses, the auto shops, the real estate, the bar revenues. And on the exact same night that Iron John Riley disappeared into the desert, Arthur Pendleton had also vanished without a trace. But Arthur hadn't left empty-handed. When the club kicked down the door to the accountant's office the following morning, the safe was blown wide open. Over $500,000 in unlaundered cash. The club's entire war chest was gone. For 15 years, the official club narrative was that the rival syndicate had killed Iron John, and a terrified Arthur Pendleton had used the chaos to steal the money and run for his life. But looking at the silver pendant resting on the table, a horrifying new reality began to dawn on Bull Riley. Iron John's necklace. The accountant's son. Arthur had this? Bull stammered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, ragged whisper. He looked at the boy, really looking at him this time. The messy brown hair, the shape of his jaw. "He told me to guard it," Leo cried, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. "He told me it was the most important thing he ever took. Please don't take it. It's all I have left of him." Bull slowly reached into his leather cut. The bikers behind him tensed, hands drifting instinctively toward their waistbands. But Bull didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a faded, dog-eared Polaroid photograph from 1988. He threw it onto the table in front of the boy. It was a picture of Iron John standing next to a younger, terrified-looking Arthur Pendleton. "Did your father?" Bull started, choking on the words as the pieces of a 15-year-old puzzle violently snapped together in his mind. "Did your father ever tell you how he got sick, Leo?" Leo looked down at the photograph, his small finger tracing the face of his late father. "He didn't get sick like a cold," Leo said softly, wiping his eyes. "He got sick because of the guilt. He told me the ghost of the man in the desert never let him sleep. And sorry, Kulaus. So the ghost of the man in the desert," Bull repeated, the words sounding hollow and metallic as they scraped their way out of his throat. He stared at the terrified 10-year-old, his mind violently rejecting the reality of what he was hearing. Behind him, the bar erupted. "Arthur killed him!" Snake Henderson yelled, kicking a wooden bar stool so hard it shattered against the cinder block wall. "That rat bastard accountant shot John, took the club's money, and ran." "I knew it. I told you 15 years ago, Bull." "Shut up, Snake," Bull growled, not taking his eyes off Leo. "Bull, he just admitted his old man took the necklace off John's corpse." Dutch Miller took a threatening step toward the booth, his hand dropping to the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his belt. "Let's take the kid out back. We'll find out exactly where his old man hid the money." "I said shut up." Bull's voice exploded like a shotgun blast in the confined space of the saloon. He whipped around, his massive frame blocking the booth entirely. He grabbed Dutch by the lapels of his leather cut and shoved him backward with such force that the enforcer crashed into a pool table, sending balls scattering across the green felt. "Nobody touches the boy," Bull snarled, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a terrifying mix of authority and desperate grief. "Iron drawn was my blood. This is my call. Anyone else want to weigh in?" The room fell dead silent again. Dutch slowly picked himself up, rushing off his cut, and gave a stiff nod of submission, stake backed away, crossing his heavily tattooed arms. Bull turned back to the booth. His massive hands were trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. He looked down at Leo, who was now openly weeping, clinging to Maggie's arm. Maggie had positioned her body between the giant biker and her nephew, looking like a mother wolf ready to die for her pup. "Maggie," Bull said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "I swear on my brother's soul, I ain't gonna lay a finger on him. But I need to know everything Arthur told this boy. Every single word." Maggie swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the angry bikers and her nephew. She gently squeezed Leo's shoulder. "Leo, honey, you need to tell him. What else did your dad say about the necklace? About the man in the desert?" Leo wiped his nose with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his cheek. He looked at the heavy silver skull resting on the table. "He didn't say much," Leo whimpered. "He wouldn't talk about it out loud. He said the walls were listening. But when he drank, he wrote things down. He couldn't sleep. He said he had to get it out of his head." Bull's eyes narrowed. "He wrote it down? Where?" Leo reached over to the far side of the booth and pulled the battered spiral notebook he'd been sketching in toward him. Its cover was torn, covered in childish doodles of muscle cars and cartoon characters. But as Leo flipped it over, the spine was heavily taped, thick with extra pages shoved into the binding. "The back half," Leo whispered, pushing the notebook across the scarred wooden table toward Bull. "He gave it to me at the hospital. He said if anyone ever came looking for the silver skull, I had to give them this." Bull picked up the notebook. It looked absurdly small in his hands. He opened it to the middle, bypassing Leo's pencil sketches, and hit the pages where the handwriting changed. It was a stark, jarring transition. The neat, methodical handwriting of an accountant was entirely absent. Instead, the pages were covered in frantic, jagged scrawls, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through. There were dates, rambling paragraphs of guilt, and Bible verses crossed out with heavy black ink. Bull's eyes tracked across the chaotic ink. October 14th. "The sand keeps shifting in my dreams. I can't wash the copper smell off my hands. He made me promise. He ordered me. But I am a coward. I am a coward who left the king in the dirt." Bull flipped the page. His breath hitched. Drawn across 2 full pages was a map. It wasn't a professional cartographer's map, but a highly detailed, localized sketch of a specific patch of the Mojave Desert. It showed the rusted-out husks of the old Iron Mountain pumping plant ruins. It showed a dry wash, a cluster of Joshua trees, and a specific rocky outcropping shaped like an anvil. Beneath the anvil rock, Arthur had drawn an X, and at the bottom of the page, written in large block letters, 34 degrees 08 N, 115 degrees 07 W. I buried the iron. I buried the gold. I kept the silver. "Dutch," Bull said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Yeah, Bull? Get the pack ready. We're riding to Iron Mountain." Bull closed the notebook and tucked it into the inside pocket of his cut. He looked down at Leo one last time, picking up the silver pendant from the table. He wrapped the heavy chain around his fist. "If this is a lie," Bull said to Maggie, his voice cold and flat, "there is nowhere on this earth you can run. I'm leaving 2 men at the door. You and the boy don't leave this bar until I get back." Within 3 minutes, the deafening roar of 24 Harley-Davidsons shook the foundations of the Copperhead Saloon. Maggie and Leo watched through the dusty front window as the pack tore out onto Route 66, leaving a massive plume of dust in their wake, heading straight into the unforgiving heart of the Mojave. It was well past midnight when the San Bernardino chapter arrived at the coordinates. The desert air had plummeted to a bitter chill, illuminated only by the harsh, sweeping beams of the motorcycle's headlights cutting through the darkness. They found the Anvil Rock exactly where Arthur's manic drawing had placed it. Bull dismounted in silence. He pulled a folding trench shovel from his saddlebag. He didn't ask for help. For the first 2 hours, the only sound in the vast, empty desert was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of Bull's shovel biting into the hard-packed dirt, mixed with his heavy, labored breathing. The rest of the chapter stood in a wide circle, smoking cigarettes in absolute silence, watching their sergeant-at-arms dig. At 3 feet deep, the shovel hit something that wasn't rock. It was a dull, hollow thud. Bull stopped. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, throwing the shovel aside, and began tearing at the earth with his bare, calloused hands. Dutch and Snake finally stepped forward, dropping to their knees to help him clear the dirt away. They unearthed a heavy, military-grade steel lockbox. It was heavily rusted, but completely intact. "Is it the cash?" Snake whispered, shining a heavy maglite down into the hole. "Keep digging," Bull ordered, his voice cracking. He hadn't come for the money. 2 feet to the left of the lockbox, the dirt gave way to something softer. Canvas. Bull gently brushed the sand away, revealing the rotting remnants of a heavy canvas tarp. As he pulled the decaying fabric back, the beam of the flashlight illuminated faded black leather, a tarnished silver belt buckle, and the unmistakable white and red patch of the Hells Angels. It was Iron John. Bull collapsed backward, sitting in the dirt, his head dropping to his chest. A ragged, terrible sound escaped his throat, the sound of 15 years of agonizing uncertainty finally breaking. The men around him respectfully took a step back, taking off their sunglasses and bowing their heads. After a long moment, Bull wiped his face with his grimy hands and turned his attention to the steel lockbox. He grabbed the crowbar from Dutch and jammed it under the rusted hasp, leaning his massive weight onto the iron bar until the lock snapped with a sharp crack. Bull threw the lid open. Inside, stacked in neat, vacuum-sealed plastic bags, was the missing $500,000. Arthur Pendleton hadn't spent a single dime of it. Resting on top of the cash was a thick manila envelope wrapped in 3 layers of heavy plastic. Bull pulled it out, tearing through the plastic to retrieve a stack of yellowed papers. It was a letter dated the exact night of their disappearance in 1989. Bull stood up, walking toward the headlights of his bike. Dutch and the others gathered close as Bull read Arthur's final confession aloud into the freezing desert night. "If you are reading this, Bull, it means the guilt finally killed me, and my boy gave you the map. I need you to know I didn't betray your brother. I loved him. He was the only one in the club who treated me like a man." Bull's voice caught. It cleared his throat and continued reading. "That night, John and I were riding back from the bank in Barstow with the cash. We got ambushed on Route 66 by the Vipers. There were 10 of them. John told me to ride into the canyon and hide. He turned his bike around and took them all on by himself so I could get away. When the gunfire stopped, I crept back. John had killed 4 of them and run the rest off, but he was hit. Bad." Dutch cursed under his breath. Snake stared blankly into the dark. "He was bleeding out in the dirt," Bull read, tears now freely streaming down his scarred face. "I tried to get him on the bike, tried to take him to a hospital, but he refused. He knew the ATF was closing in on the chapter. He knew if he died in a hospital, the feds would confiscate the war chest. He ordered me to take the money and bury it. He told me to hide, to wait until the heat died down, and then return it to you so the club could survive." Bull's hands shook violently as he read the final lines. He gave me his silver pendant to prove to you that it was his order. Then he made me promise to bury him deep so the vipers couldn't parade his body around. I buried my president in the dark. But I was so scared, Bull. I was a coward. I ran, and I changed my name, and I never had the courage to come back. I kept the money safe. But the ghost of the man in the desert never let me sleep. Forgive me. Bull slowly lowered the letter. For 15 years they had hunted Arthur Pendleton, believing him to be a traitor, a thief, and a murderer. In reality, Arthur was just a terrified accountant who had dutifully followed the final desperate orders of his dying president, living in solitary torment to protect the club's future. Bull looked down at his brother's grave. He finally knew the truth. And John hadn't been murdered in a cowardly double-cross. He had gone down like a king, fighting off 10 men to protect his club. The sun was just beginning to crest over the jagged peaks of the Mojave when the roar of the motorcycles returned to the Copperhead Saloon. Inside, Maggie and Leo were sitting in the exact same booth. They hadn't slept. When the heavy wooden door swung open and Bull walked in, covered in desert dirt and sweat, Maggie instinctively pulled Leo behind her. Bull didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He looked 15 years older, but somehow lighter. He walked slowly over to the booth. He didn't say a word to Maggie. He just looked down the 10-year-old boy. Bull reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy silver skull with the chipped ruby eye. He held it out. Leo hesitated, then slowly reached out his small hand. Bull dropped the heavy pendant into the boy's palm. "Your father wasn't a thief, Leo," Bull said, his deep voice thick with emotion. "And he wasn't a murderer. He was a man who was given a burden too heavy to carry. But he protected my brother's legacy. He kept his secret safe." Bull placed his massive, calloused hand gently on top of Leo's head. "You wear that silver proud, kid. And if anyone ever asks you where you got it, you tell them Arthur Pendleton gave it to you. And you tell them the San Bernardino chapter said nobody gets to touch it." Bull turned and walked out of the bar, the morning light framing his massive silhouette as the jukebox finally clicked back on, playing a soft, familiar tune into the dusty air. The truth can hide in the darkest corners for decades, only to be brought into the light by the most unexpected hands. Arthur Pendleton carried a crushing secret to his grave, but his son's innocence finally set 2 tormented souls free. If this gripping story of loyalty, misunderstanding, and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible true stories.